family was in town.
Good.
They're leaving today. I don't know where my tissues are. That's all right.
The Ferguson unrest has captured international headlines.
People in this community are baffled by the latest development. Behind me, it is a much different scene from yesterday.
A grandmother and a 2-year-old boy are recovering this morning from gunshots.
On the morning of October 31st, 2025, residents of a quiet Wichita, Kansas neighborhood awoke to a tragedy that would shock the community and capture national attention. Angelynn Mock, a 47-year-old former television news anchor, allegedly stabbed her 80-year-old mother, Anita Avers, to death in their shared home. What makes this case particularly compelling is not merely its brutality, but the profound contradictions it presents. A daughter who once delivered the news now making headlines herself, a family therapist unable to prevent violence in her own home, and a claim of self-defense that prosecutors reject as implausible. This case raises fundamental questions about family dynamics, the limits of self-defense law, the hidden pressures that can lead to explosive violence, and how we reconcile public personas with private realities. Angelynn Mock's professional trajectory reads like a cautionary tale about the instability of modern careers. 4 years, she was a familiar face delivering morning news to St. Louis residents as an anchor and reporter for KTVI Fox 2 News from March 2011 to February 2015. Before that, she reported for Fox 25 in Oklahoma City, building a reputation in local broadcast journalism, a demanding field requiring poise under pressure, quick thinking, and the ability to present a composed exterior regardless of personal circumstances. Television news anchoring is a profession that demands certain psychological attributes, emotional regulation, public performance skills, and the capacity to compartmentalize personal stress while maintaining a professional demeanor. Those who knew Mock in her broadcasting days would have seen someone polished, articulate, and seemingly in control. The transition from this high-visibility career to data management, consulting, and sales positions represents a significant professional shift that merits examination. After leaving Fox 2 in 2015, Mock's career path became more fragmented. She worked briefly as an account executive at Transfers Merchant Services for 9 months in 2016, then as a regional sales manager at Security Card Services in St. Louis for 10 months in 2017. By 2019, she had transitioned to working as a data management consultant, a position she held at the time of the incident. This role involved remote work across multiple cities: Kansas City, Chicago, Indianapolis, and Columbia, Missouri, suggesting a lifestyle of professional instability and geographic rootlessness, even while living with her mother in Wichita. The contrast between the public-facing glamour of television news and the more anonymous, transactional nature of sales and consulting work is striking. For someone who once had their face recognized in grocery stores and restaurants, the loss of that public identity could have psychological ramifications. Career transitions in midlife, particularly involuntary ones or those driven by industry changes, are associated with increased stress, identity crises, and mental health challenges. What remains unclear from public records is why Mock left broadcasting. Was it a voluntary career change, or did industry consolidation and the decline of local news force a hand? Did personal circumstances, perhaps related to caring for her aging mother, necessitate the move to Wichita? These questions are relevant because they speak to potential stresses that may have contributed to the family dynamic that ultimately turned deadly. Anita Avers represents an equally tragic figure in this narrative. At 80 years old, she had dedicated more than 2 decades to helping families navigate their most difficult conflicts as a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist at Wichita Counseling Professionals. Colleagues described her as compassionate and deeply committed to her work, someone who presumably understood the dynamics of family dysfunction, the warning signs of escalating conflict, and the importance of boundaries and communication. The irony is almost unbearable. A woman who professionally helped families resolve their differences died violently at the hands of her own daughter. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether professional expertise translates to personal relationships, or whether family dynamics operate under different rules that even trained therapists cannot always navigate successfully. Avers' age is also significant. At 80, she would have been increasingly dependent on others for certain aspects of daily living, though reports suggest she was still working and functioning independently. The role reversal that occurs when adult children begin caring for aging parents can create complex power dynamics, resentment, and stress on both sides. The caregiver-care-recipient relationship, even when functioning well, involves negotiations around autonomy, dignity, and control that can become flashpoints for conflict. Neighbors described the household as quiet, with no history of police calls for domestic disturbances. This suggests either a genuinely peaceful coexistence or, more troublingly, a family skilled at keeping problems private, a common pattern in homes where violence eventually erupts. The absence of visible conflict does not mean the absence of tension. It may simply indicate that the family maintained a facade of normalcy until that facade catastrophically collapsed. At approximately 7:52 a.m. on Halloween morning, the Wichita Police Department received a 911 call reporting a cutting at a residence in the 1500 block of East Crowley Street. Before that call was made, however, a dramatic scene unfolded on a quiet residential street that would provide crucial evidence about Mock's state of mind immediately after stabbing. Neighbor Alyssa Castro and her boyfriend were driving when they encountered Mock approaching their vehicle. Castro would later describe a horrifying sight. Mock was covered in blood. Her hands were filled with blood. Her body was filled with blood. Mock frantically asked them to call 911, taking Castro's boyfriend's phone before running back toward the house. This encounter is significant for several reasons. First, it establishes that Mock did not flee the scene or attempt to conceal what had happened. Her immediate instinct was to summon help, which could support her later claim that she was acting in self-defense and was not attempting to hide a premeditated murder. However, it also raises questions. If she had just defended herself against a deadly attack by her elderly mother, why did she leave Avers alone inside the house? Was she in shock? Was she seeking help for her mother or for herself? The dispatch audio reveals that Mock told 911 operators she had stabbed the mother to save herself, clearly establishing from the outset that she was claiming self-defense. This immediate articulation of a legal justification is notable. It suggests either that Mock genuinely believed she had no choice but to use deadly force, or that she quickly recognized she needed a legal defense and began constructing one immediately. When officers arrived around 8 a.m., they found Mock outside the home with cuts on her hands. The nature of these injuries has not been fully disclosed, but they are consistent with either defensive wounds, if she were truly fighting off an attacker, or injuries sustained during the act of stabbing, which can occur when a knife wielder's hand slips onto blade during forceful thrusts. Inside the home, officers discovered Anita Avers in her bed, unresponsive, with multiple stab wounds to her upper body. She was rushed to a local hospital but was pronounced dead at 8:26 a.m., less than an hour after the 911 call. The location of the attack, Avers' own bedroom, with her found in or near her bed, is particularly significant. This was not a confrontation in a common area of the house or during an argument in the kitchen. The attack occurred in what should have been Avers' most private, vulnerable space. The fact that Avers sustained multiple stab wounds suggests repeated violent action rather than a single defensive strike. While the exact number of wounds has not been publicly released, the plural form in the description by some sources as horrifying suggests a level of violence that prosecutors would likely argue exceeds what would be necessary for self-defense, even against an armed attacker. Mock faces a charge of first-degree murder under Kansas law, which requires a prosecution to prove that the killing was intentional and premeditated. Kansas statutes annotate 21 to 5402 defines first-degree murder as a killing of a human being committed intentionally and with premeditation. Premeditation does not require extensive planning. Even a few moments of thought before acting can satisfy this element if the defendant formed the intent to kill and then carried it out. The penalty for first-degree murder in Kansas is severe. The Hard 50 law, formerly known as Jessica's Law, allows for sentences of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 50 years in particularly heinous cases, though this typically applies to murders involving sexual offenses against children. For most first-degree murder convictions, Kansas law provides for life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 25 years, or life without the possibility of parole, depending on aggravating and mitigating factors. The charge itself tells us that prosecutors believe they can prove Mock not only killed her mother, but did so with premeditation. They are not charging second-degree murder, intentional killing without premeditation, or voluntary manslaughter, killing in the heat of passion with adequate provocation. This charging decision suggests prosecutors believe the evidence contradicts Mock's self-defense narrative and supports a conclusion that she planned, even briefly, to kill her mother. Mock's assertion that she acted in self-defense will likely be the centerpiece of her legal strategy, assuming the case goes to trial. Kansas, like most states, recognizes self-defense as a complete justification for homicide under specific circumstances. Kansas law, as articulated in KSA 21-5222, allows the use of force which is intended or likely to cause death or great bodily harm only when the defendant reasonably believes such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to themselves or another. Several elements must be proven for a successful self-defense claim. The danger must be immediate, not prospective or speculative. A person cannot claim self-defense if they kill to prevent some future harm. The question is whether at the moment of the killing, the defendant reasonably believed they were about to be killed or seriously injured. The defendant's belief that deadly force was necessary must be objectively reasonable. That is, would a reasonable person in the same circumstances have believed deadly force was necessary? The defendant's subjective fear alone is not sufficient. There must be an objective basis for that fear. The force used must be proportionate to the threat faced. While deadly force can be met with deadly force, a minor physical threat generally cannot be met with lethal response. Kansas is a stand-your-ground state, meaning there is no duty to retreat before using deadly force in self-defense, even if retreat is possible. This applies in one's own home as well as in public places where the person has a legal right to be. A person who is the initial aggressor cannot claim self-defense unless they have effectively withdrawn from the confrontation and communicated that withdrawal to the other party. Applying these principles to Mock's case reveals the significant challenges a defense faces. Prosecutors would likely argue several points. First, the disparity in age, size, and physical capability between a 47-year-old woman and an 80-year-old woman makes it difficult to establish that Mock faced an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Unless Avers was wielding a weapon, and even then, the physical imbalance suggests Mock could have retreated, disarmed her mother, or used non-lethal force. Second, the location and nature of the attack work against the self-defense narrative. Avers was found in her bedroom, in or near her bed. If she initiated an attack from her bed against her daughter, it would have been relatively easy for Mock to leave the room and call for help rather than engage in deadly force. The multiple stab wounds suggest a sustained attack rather than a single defensive action. Third, Mock's hand injuries, while potentially consistent with a struggle, could also be explained as injuries sustained while stabbing someone forcefully, a common occurrence in knife attacks. The prosecution will likely argue these wounds do not prove Avers attacked Mock, but rather show the physical realities of knife violence. Finally, the absence of any history of violence by Avers, combined with her age and frailty, will make it difficult to establish that Mock's belief in facing deadly force was reasonable. Prosecutors may ask, how could a reasonable person believe an 80-year-old woman posed a deadly threat requiring multiple stab wounds to neutralize? Matricide, the killing of one's mother, is among the rarest forms of homicide. Research consistently shows that while parents are sometimes killed by their children, such cases represent a tiny fraction of all murders, and matricides are even less common than patricides, killing of one's father. The psychological and social taboos against harming one's mother are profound across virtually all cultures, making matricide particularly shocking when it occurs. Studies of matricide have identified several typologies of offenders and circumstances. A significant proportion of matricide cases involve individuals with severe psychiatric disorders, particularly schizophrenia and other psychotic conditions. In these cases, the killing may occur during a psychotic episode involving delusions or command hallucinations. Adult children caring for aging, demanding, or impaired parents sometimes reach a breaking point. These cases often involve long-standing resentment, caregiver burnout, and a sense of being trapped in an impossible situation. In some cases, adults who suffer childhood abuse kill their mothers after years of unresolved trauma, sometimes triggered by continued emotional or psychological abuse. Though less common, some matricides occur in the context of disputes over money, inheritance, or control of assets. Individuals with severe personality disorders, particularly antisocial or borderline personality disorder, may kill their mothers during escalated conflicts, often involving issues of control, abandonment, or perceived rejection. Without access to comprehensive psychological evaluations of Mock, it is impossible to determine which, if any, of these categories might apply. However, several aspects of the case are worth noting. Mock had no reported history of mental illness severe enough to come to public attention. She functioned successfully in demanding professional roles, and there is no evidence of prior violence or serious conflict with her mother. This absence of warning signs makes the case particularly puzzling. The Mock-Avers living arrangement, an adult child residing with an aging parent, is increasingly common in American society due to economic pressures, aging demographics, and changing family structures. However, these arrangements can create significant psychological stresses for both parties. For the adult child, particularly one who has experienced career setbacks or personal disappointments, living with an elderly parent can trigger feelings of failure, regression, and loss of autonomy. The adult child may feel trapped between the identity of a competent, independent adult and the reality of dependence on a parent. This can be especially acute for someone like Mock, who once had professional success and public recognition. For the elderly parent, having an adult child move back home can involve complex emotions, desire to help mixed with concerns about their own independence, pride in supporting their child mixed with disappointment about their child's circumstances, and the practical challenges of adjusting to shared living space. These arrangements often work well, but they can also become pressure cookers when compounded by financial stress, health issues, differences in lifestyle and habits, and unresolved emotional issues from earlier in the relationship. The mundane irritations of cohabitation, disagreements over cleanliness, noise, privacy, schedules, can escalate when both parties are dealing with their own age-related challenges, midlife identity crises for the adult child, decline and vulnerability for the elderly parent. Moreover, when an adult child becomes a caregiver for an aging parent, role reversal can be emotionally complicated. The parent who once had authority must now accept help and direction from their child, which can generate resistance, resentment, and conflict. The child, meanwhile, must balance respect for their parents' autonomy with appropriate concern and supervision. These dynamics can deteriorate, especially without external support or intervention. As the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office builds its case, several categories of evidence will be crucial. The medical examiner's report will detail the number, location, depth, and angle of the stab wounds. This information can help reconstruct the attack and determine whether it is consistent with self-defense or with an aggressive assault. For instance, wounds to the victim's back would be difficult to reconcile with a self-defense claim. The concentration of wounds in particular areas, the force required to inflict them, and the trajectory of the wounds can all provide insight into the relative positions of Mock and Avers during the attack. The knife used in the stabbing, once recovered and analyzed, will provide important information. Was it a kitchen knife from the home, suggesting a spontaneous attack during a domestic dispute? Or was it a weapon Mock had in her possession, possibly suggesting premeditation? The size and type of knife will also be relevant to assessing whether Avers could have realistically wielded it as a threat against Mock. The pattern of blood distribution at the scene can reveal the positions of the individuals during the attack, the sequence of events, and whether there was a struggle. Blood spatter analysis can also help determine whether Mock's injuries occurred during a defensive struggle or were sustained during the act of stabbing. A forensic examination of Mock's hand injuries will be critical. Are they defensive wounds, typically found on the palms and inside of the forearms, consistent with attempting to grab or deflect a blade? Or are they consistent with knife injuries that occur to an attacker, such as a hand slipping onto the blade during forceful stabbing? The severity and location of these injuries will be scrutinized by both prosecution and defense. Analysis of the knife will show whose fingerprints and DNA are present. If only Mock's fingerprints are on the weapon, it would contradict a claim that Avers was wielding it. If both women's DNA is present, it might support a struggle scenario, though it would not necessarily prove who was the aggressor. Investigators will likely examine Mock's phone, computer, and social media activity in the days and weeks before the killing. Were there searches related to violence, self-defense, or family conflict? Were there messages to friends or family indicating tension with her mother? Digital footprints can provide evidence of premeditation or, conversely, can support a narrative of spontaneous violence during a crisis. Tests on both Mock and Avers will reveal whether substances, alcohol, prescription medications, illegal drugs, played any role. Some medications, particularly certain psychiatric drugs or their sudden discontinuation, can affect behavior and judgment. The exact words Mock used during the 911 call, her tone of voice, and any background sounds will be analyzed. Was she hysterical and panicked, consistent with someone who just experienced a traumatic attack? Or was she calm and calculated, possibly indicating premeditation and an attempt to establish a defense? Alyssa Castro's account of seeing Mock covered in blood is powerful testimony. Her observations about Mock's demeanor, her apparent panic and distress, could support a defense narrative of trauma and fear. However, prosecutors may argue this performance was calculated to establish an innocent appearance. The first responders' observations when they arrive at the scene will be important. What did Mock say to them? How did she behave? Was she seeking help for her mother or focus on her own injuries? These details can provide insight into her mental state and priorities immediately after the killing. One of the most unsettling aspects of this case is the disconnect between Mock's public image and the private reality that culminated in violence. Mock was a television news anchor, a role that projects competence, stability, and authority. People who saw her on television would have had no reason to suspect any internal turmoil or family dysfunction. This disconnect is not unique to this case. There is a well-documented phenomenon of high-achieving individuals, particularly women, who maintain flawless public personas while dealing with significant private struggles. The pressure to appear successful, the stigma around mental health issues and family problems, and the professional necessity of projecting confidence can create a facade that hides mounting stress, depression, anxiety, or even desperation. Research on women in midlife has identified this period as one of particular vulnerability. Between ages 40 and 55, many women face multiple stresses simultaneously: career challenges or transitions, caregiving responsibilities for both children and aging parents, the sandwich generation, hormonal changes associated with perimenopause and menopause, relationship stresses, and existential questions about identity and purpose. When these stresses accumulate without adequate support or coping mechanisms, the risk of mental health crises increases. Mock's career trajectory, from the public recognition of television news to the relative anonymity of consulting work, combined with living with her elderly mother and apparently lacking a nuclear family of her own, suggests someone who may have been dealing with significant life disappointments and role ambiguity. This is not to excuse violence, but to understand the context in which it occurred. Reports indicate that Mock's social media presence showed family-oriented posts with photos depicting warmth and affection between her and her mother. This carefully curated image of family harmony is particularly jarring given what allegedly occurred. It raises questions about the authenticity of social media presentations and the psychological burden of maintaining appearances even when relationships are troubled. Social media has created new pressures of performance of happiness and success. People selectively share positive moments while hiding conflicts, disappointments, and struggles. This can create a feedback loop where individuals feel compelled to maintain a false narrative even as their actual circumstances deteriorate. For someone like Mock, whose professional identity involved public presentation, the habit of projecting an image regardless of reality may have been particularly ingrained. The existence of apparently affectionate family photos also complicates a narrative for investigators and prosecutors. If the relationship appeared loving, what changed? Was there a sudden crisis, or was the affection only surface level, hiding deeper resentments? Did Mock feel trapped by expectations, both self-imposed and external, to be the dutiful, loving daughter even when the relationship had become intolerable for reasons we may never fully understand? This case highlights the vulnerability of elderly individuals, even those who appear independent and capable. Avers was a working professional, a licensed therapist who presumably had her cognitive faculties intact and was still contributing to society. Yet she was killed in her own home, in her own bed, by someone she had raised and trusted. Elder abuse, whether physical, emotional, financial, or through neglect, is a growing concern as the population ages. Most elder abuse occurs at the hands of family members, particularly adult children or spouses serving as caregivers. While murder represents the extreme end of the spectrum, it underscores a need for better systems to identify at-risk elderly individuals and provide support to families under strain. The fact that Avers was a family therapist adds another layer. Presumably, she would have been trained to recognize signs of family dysfunction and escalating conflict. Did she see warning signs but minimize them because it involved her own daughter? Did professional knowledge create a false sense of security that she could manage any family issues that arose? Or was this truly a situation that developed so rapidly that even a trained professional could not anticipate or prevent it? If Mock was serving as a caregiver for her mother, either formally or informally, her case illustrates a desperate need for support systems for family caregivers. Caregiving for elderly parents is physically, emotionally, and financially draining. Without adequate respite, resources, and emotional support, caregivers can experience burnout that manifests as depression, anxiety, resentment, and in extreme cases, violence. Society tends to assume that adult children should care for their aging parents, often without acknowledging the enormous burden this creates or providing sufficient community resources to support these families. Programs offering respite care, counseling, support groups, and financial assistance are often inadequate or difficult to access. The result is isolated caregivers dealing with impossible situations without help. Even if Mock was not a primary caregiver, the stresses of living with an elderly parent while managing one's own midlife challenges deserve greater recognition and support. Communities need better systems for identifying families under strain and connecting them with resources before crisis situations develop. While we do not know whether Mock was experiencing mental health issues, this case underscores the importance of accessible, destigmatized mental health care. If Mock was struggling with depression, anxiety, career disappointment, or other psychological challenges, did she have access to appropriate care? Did she seek help? Was treatment available and affordable? Mental health care in the United States remains inadequate, with long wait times for appointments, high costs, insurance limitations, and persistent stigma. People in crisis often do not receive help until after tragedy occurs. Investment in preventive mental health care, early intervention, and community mental health resources could potentially prevent some cases of family violence. As of November 3, 2025, Mock remains in custody on $1 million bond, and the case is in its preliminary stages. Beyond the specifics of this case, broader questions persist. How can we better support families dealing with the stresses of caregiving and intergenerational living? How can we identify and intervene in families at risk of violence before tragedy occurs? How do we balance respect for family privacy with a need to protect vulnerable individuals? And how do we create a society where mental health struggles, career disappointments, and family conflicts can be addressed openly without shame? The Mock Avers case will ultimately be decided in a courtroom based on evidence and legal standards. But its significance extends beyond that verdict. It serves as a painful reminder of the fragility of family bonds, the hidden burdens many people carry, and the catastrophic consequences when those burdens become unbearable without adequate support and intervention. As we await further developments in this case, we must resist the temptation to rush to judgment while also recognizing the serious questions it raises about elder safety, family dynamics, mental health care, and the gap between the lives we project and the realities we live. Only by grappling honestly with these difficult issues can we hope to prevent future tragedies and build communities that better support families in crisis. Don't forget to subscribe to Crazy Crime News for more updates.